James, in the New Zealand construction procurement model, or say just construction procurement model, probably all around the world, we've got this risk hand grenade that we keep passing from one silo to another, right? Risk hand grenade's a word I stole out of Marty's handbook. But
I don't know what you're talking about.
you know what I'm talking about. but it's such a common occurrence, though. We keep passing it from the client wants to pass it on to the main contractor. The main contractor wants to pass it downstream, and the people working on the ground carry the most risk. How do we better manage that, in your opinion?
Yeah, it's a hot topic for sure. I sort of want to cut back to the side here. Said before about having the right amount of money. And one of the keys to risk, and it's a terrible understood truth in New Zealand construction, that risk is 5%. And risk might be 5% if there's a certain amount of definition in the base, and that you've priced things generously in the base and all that sort of thing. And now, of course, anyone who's looked at worldwide trends and all that sort of stuff will clearly understand that risk is not 5%. And there's actually some really good guidelines out there that our client organisations can use. But the next step is actually for those client organisations to take seriously what those guidelines are and to be able to contract accordingly. So a great example is in the UK, they've got a system, or they used to have a system called the GRIP process, the Guide to Railway Investment Programming. And it was a 9-stage process for project development, which gave really clear instructions on what the industry tells them the uncertainty is at each stage of that development based on design and all that sort of stuff. But of course, they were also doing it in an environment where the industry was quite predictable. And they had a number of established contractors who were used to doing the work. Railways, of course, are often quite a controlled environment. And so therefore, the way that they ran it was quite, predictable. Now, to give you an example, when you went into a D&C in the GRIP process, it was considered sort of stage 4 of GRIP, which is something like a 35% design or something like that. They expected you to have a risk assessment that was returning something like 20%. And then on top of that, they added plus 25 to minus 10%. As a potential variance on what the client should be expecting from the market. Now, that's quite a lot. Mm. And in New Zealand, we're going into alliances at 30% design with 5% risk. Mm. So it seems strange to me that the knowledge and the experience and the industry repetition of this is out there, but until people choose to take it seriously within the industry, then it's not going to work. So whatever risk exchange it is that we negotiate through a contract is fine, providing there's enough money to fund it. And as I say, back to the human factors, there's an understanding that if things go wrong or they continue to go wrong, and we've certainly had some projects recently, if we think in the last 12 to 14 months, we've had a number of COVID-related adjudications and that type of thing where we've had to settle contracts in that way. We've had a massive storm. And so we're largely dealing with any project that's been going for more than 3 or 4 years as phase 2 massive black swan events. And those are the sort of things that our procurement process from the risk perspective just can't cope with. And so, number one, be fair in your allocation of risk. And of course, based on the standard principles, which we all agree, which are place the risk in the best place for it to be managed. Yep. Make sure that's very clear, make sure the communication's clear, and make sure it's adequately funded. But also, make sure that you're very clear from the client perspective on where it is the client probably needs to step in and help when it's not appropriate for a contractor to have to absorb certain costs. So that's the way I feel about it. But it does again fall right back onto those collaborative principles we were talking about and fairness through the contracting process.
So collaboration is key.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Absolutely.
So Matt, you're dealing with it from the other end of it, where you're actually taking on a lot of this risk. Hmm. How do you think we can actually stop the risk hand grenade being handed down to you?
Yeah, well, I mentioned before is that I try and define that very clearly in our offers. And that's why I have a massive list of clarifications.
So you mean you tag the shit out of it?
Pretty much, yeah. But I think that's the fair way to do it. I know that if I was to put on 5, 10, 15% risk, that may be appropriate in some of these tenders that I just won't get through. Mm. So my approach would be to at least give the head contractor and principal the opportunity to understand what the base cost is, what those risks are, and then hopefully I have the opportunity to get in and help explain work with them to value that risk by having a collaborative discussion, saying, okay, these are items outside of our control, so it best sits with you. But this is how I deal with it, and this is what our time or cost delays or time and cost may be to manage that risk. There's other elements that certainly sit within my realm to manage the risk, but I need to understand the scope or the inputs for me to be able to price those better. And my whole approach is to try and make that as clear as possible in our proposal so that we can then move forward and value that.
Yeah,
I think that's a good approach. I review a lot of tenders that are coming in, and there seems to be this fear from subcontractors to ask questions. And admittedly, it's usually in a 3-week period because that's all the tender is, and that's something else we could talk about, this procurement period or tender period. But in that period, you've got a very finite time to review the drawing specifications and ask the right questions. The fear that they have by asking the questions is that their price will be undermined somehow when they allow for that thing that they've spotted, and they put a contingency in there that the others haven't spotted, and they're going to win the project because they haven't spotted it, which is not a good place to be.
Oh,
So I encourage all the guys tendering to basically ask the questions, because the one thing that happens from that is we'll pass those questions upwards, and then I have to give the answers out. To every single subcontractor. So all of a sudden, you're leveling the playing field. So if there's one thing I would advise is to ask, or to agree with you, is actually to ask those questions, because the answer's got to go out to all of the other subcontractors. So all of a sudden, that $100,000, you think, oh shit, that's going to cost $100,000. We don't want to put that in there. Well, I'll tell you what, we won't put it in there, and we'll see if we get it as a variation later. Doesn't work.
So it's your quickest road to dispute.
Yeah,
isn't it?
absolutely. So ask the question. Don't be scared of asking that question. Remember, the answer's got to go out to all of the tenderers. So all of a sudden, that playing field is level.
Yeah, and a lot of what I see are actually head contractors saying to subcontractors, "No tags,
No tags.
no tags."
You really?
No, yeah, no tags. Don't want any tags.
Yeah.
Which is just commercial suicide as far as I'm concerned. Because if you're going to take a subcontract on with no tags on the lowest price, which often they do to try and win the tender, those guys are going to struggle to get information. They're going to struggle to be managed in many ways. I mean, I work for a lot of subcontractors that are mismanaged by main contractors. So many. So they're on a losing wicket to begin with, which means so is the contractor. But the trouble is the contracts, the subcontracts, have clauses in them which say, you're only entitled to an extension of time for anything we get. You're not entitled to any costs. And in this climate as well, where, there's a complete lack of understanding of fluctuation clauses in contracts. So, project gets delayed, and subcontractors, like starting 2 years later than they should have done, and main contractors go, I don't care, there's no fluctuations. You're just going to have to get on with it. Well, actually, no. Yeah. The basis of the bargain, well, you're going to do it here. You're entitled to increased costs as a variation. That complete lack of understanding is killing subcontractors, and particularly given all the delayed issues due to COVID. We've got one at the moment. I've just written to a main contractor to say, actually, no, the price is not fixed. We priced it in 2019. You can't come and expect us to start, 4 years later at the price of 2019. It's just nonsense. Yeah, but main contractors just constantly come back and go, yeah, well, no fluctuations. You just got to get on with it. You've got to start next month, or we're going to start claiming against you. It's these bad behaviours due to lack of education and communication and risk identification. Right from
does that start above though?
It does. It does start above because. There's always that pressure, isn't there, on price? Whereas if we have the early contractor involvement process where, I always say to clients, listen, these guys are on the ground building the work. These designers are actually, looking through their books and their catalogues at these nice products. Oh, yeah, it comes from China, but don't worry about that. It looks nicer than that one, from New Zealand. These guys are on the ground. They know what procurement times are for them. They're working with it. They know whether or not they can actually get it in time to meet the program if everything's running late. These guys need to be used in that process to try and eliminate
Sounds like an ECI.
wastage. Exactly.
However,
ECI.
However,
and if we go to that early contractor involvement and have that collaborative way of working, most of these disputes I get involved with will be, negligible.
Does come back to that big word though, which is trust. And what I've found, and I've worked on both the client side and the contractor side quite a lot recently, is the amount of distrust. And I would count on maybe one hand the number of people I believe sit in our construction industry at the moment where the clients are prepared to listen and take their word as being reasonable and not just the behaviour of a contractor. And there's just not that many of them that our client organisations seem to trust, and they need to, because as you say, it's not generally in the contractor's interest to feed a whole heap of nonsense.
Why
They
do you
do
think
tend to
that
be
is?
speaking from experience, you know.
Yeah. So is that the client, or is that the advice the client's getting?
It's probably a combination.
Yeah.
And the difficult thing is, I mean, there's not a huge amount I remember from my university education, but one of the things that has stayed with me was the prisoner's dilemma. I don't know if you guys have come across the prisoner's dilemma, but it's a concept where two prisoners are given the same offer. They're not allowed to speak to each other. And if they choose to collaborate and trust, they'll get a better overall outcome. However, what inevitably happens is that somehow the other one tries to game the other one and they end up with the worst possible outcome. And it feels to me like we're trapped in that cycle a little bit construction-wise, where we know that if we were to trust each other and work together and be collaborative, we'd get a better outcome. But due to our fears of the behaviour of the other side, we end up falling into the trap of actually getting the worst outcome.
And is that what's prohibiting our subcontractors, main contractors, and the likes of entering into early works, PCSAs, ECIs with our principals? Because effectively it's a lack of trust. Why are we having to go to a competitive tender each time to select those guys?
But part of what, in defence of the principals, I would just say that these guys have been caught in a trap also, where they're already in a contract situation that's probably not very favourable towards them. And it's a bit like the bully who just passes on someone who's getting bullied who bullies someone else. And so I think, as you say, it probably starts at the top and it needs to trickle right through and make sure those contractual values and approaches are repeated right through the process.
I think the key here is collaboration, trust, meeting of the minds. Let's fucking work together.
Yeah, and it takes time.
Yeah.
And you need to create the time.
Bearing in mind that behind all that, it's either a seller's or a buyer's market, depending on the cycle that's going on internationally.
Yeah.
And that adds another factor.
Another layer of complexity.
Yeah.
I suppose that's why we're here, aren't we? Discussing
Take
this
that.
complex subject.
Take that back though, if you start at a truly collaborative approach and you start engaging with contractors at a high level at a program of works or a asset management plan or forward works plan, and you're actually looking to level out the procurement of your packages to the market at all levels, not just head contractor, down to subcontractors as well, then you'll get a leveling of that, you'll build trust over a period of time, and you hopefully get better outcomes, which is...
It's a long game.
Yeah, it is.
It's a long game.
How do you feel, Matt, about the continuity? Because I feel like the industry's gone into quite a lot of flux, and what that's meant is when I first joined, I worked on Waterview, for example, and Waterview was the product of pretty much the same sort of characters working together for about 20 years, and it was a great outcome. But I feel like the industry's sort of been shaken up now, and it doesn't feel like that sort of continuity exists so much between these organisations anymore. And that would include, the contractors that are used to working with subbies and that type of thing. Because as you say, if you've got consistent work with the same sort of people in an ongoing way, then that trust builds, you get better outcomes, you sort of know what you can expect, and you get safety from that.
Yeah, I'll probably maybe not be the best person to comment because we've been working in quite a different industry outside of Auckland for quite a while, so I don't really have a feel for that.
Yeah.
We definitely do have ups and downs in terms of our workload, and we're always looking ahead 6 to 12 months, saying where are our holes opening up and trying to really target projects accordingly, which is a bit of a challenge in itself. But that continuity, not sure.